Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to be a continuation of a previous lesson from the 15th chapter in the book of Matthew. Made it all the way up till the 20th verse. We're going to take this from 21 all the way home to 39. In the sequence of events described in Matthew's 15th chapter does have a parallel in Mark's 7th and 8th chapter. The events described therein first are he entertains a controversy pertaining to tradition, and then he elevates it and really reverses the standard of cleanliness. The nature of the controversy between himself and the Pharisees and the scribes from Jerusalem pertained to the nature of purity and cleanliness. Then he also, in what we're going to read today, he heals a severely demon-possessed girl in Gentile territory after some reluctance or resistance. Then in Mark's account, he has the healing of a blind and deaf man. And then in the 8th chapter, he describes the same thing we read after. We're going to cover this today, too. The feeding of the 4,000, not to be confused with the feeding of the 5,000, which we recently read of in the 14th chapter of Matthew. So the 15th chapter opens, there's scribes and Pharisees, they're from Jerusalem, and they came all the way up to Galilee to harass and bother this man, and they say, "Why do your disciples transgress the tradition of the elders? For they do not wash their hands when they eat bread." But he answering said to them, "Why do you transgress the command of Elohim because of your tradition?" They're nitpicking over traditions. He appeals to a higher entity, that of a command. Traditions are born of men. Commandments derive from divinity. So traditions the Pharisees were an intentionally traditional people. They had these oral traditions of these additional injunctions to the Mosaic law that they added to themselves and observed just so people could look up to them on a pedestal. And they were really missing the weightier matters of religion. Now, washing your hands physically is a good hygienic practice, but it's not necessarily as spiritual as making their out. And the specific commandment that he chides them is the 5th one, that of honoring thy mother and their father. And the one of the traditions was this insidious circumvention of violating that commandment through what was known as Corban. This consisted of just a donation to the temple that could procure forgiveness by paying the temple amount. But verse 6 is certainly released from respecting his father or mother. So you have nullified the commandments of Elohim by your traditions. Traditions, they are neutral. There's not necessarily anything wrong with them, but there is potential that's a neutral term. These traditions were against the commandments of Elohim. This was a clear-cut commandment. Do not disrespect, do not dishonor, do not do not degrade in any way, shape, or form your mother and your father. But they were doing that through this practice of Corban. They taught it and they did it. Hypocrites, Isaiah rightly prophesied about you, saying, "This people draw near to me with their mouth and respect me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. But in vain do they worship me, teaching as teachings the commands of men." They had the lip surface religion. They could say the right things and they looked the part. But underneath the superficial exterior was a heart that was far away and estranged from the ones that they were praising with their lips. And he once more establishes the predominance and the preeminence of the commandments he calls their traditions commandments of men. He's stressing the commandments of Yahweh. They're nitpicking and bothering his disciples, and by connection himself, over their silly tradition. Verse 11, not that which goes into the mouth defiles the man, but that which out of the mouth, this defiles the man. He's addressing the crowd, so his attention there is the Pharisees came when there was a crowd gathering around him. He says this to them, and he says it's not the Jews had dietary standards, clean foods and unclean foods, forbidden foods and foods which were permissible, but he completely demolishes that system. So as Christians, we can eat pork and bacon and things that were forbidden, and we're going to meet one of the filthy animals according to the Jews, the dogs. We'll get there when we get there. But what comes out of the mouth, so it's not what you put in, it's what comes out of the mouth, because the words of our mouth are a reflection from our hearts and an emanation from our minds. And And he says, verse 14, leave them alone. They are blind leaders of the blind. And if the blind leads the blind, both shall fall into a ditch. Vision and light and compass and direction are essential for leaders. So blind people gravitate towards blind teachers, but it leads nowhere good. He's telling them, beware the leaven of the Pharisees, as he says in Luke's 12th chapter. Leave them away, stay away from them, because if you follow them, they're just going to lead you into a ditch, which is hell, essentially. Nowhere good. So they do not know where they are headed themselves, and they are not fit or qualified to direct others. They are blind themselves spiritually, and they say the right things, but their hearts are far away from the one they worship with their lips. Verse 17, Peter asks for additional explanation for the parable, and Yahshua answers thus in verse 17, do you not understand that whatever enters into the mouth goes into the stomach and is cast out into the sewer? But what comes out of the mouth comes from the heart, and these defile the man. For out of the heart comes forth wicked reasonings, murders, adulteries, whorings, thefts, false witnesses, slanders. These defile the man, but to eat with unwashed hands does not defile the man. The spiritual element is obviously the greater priority than the physical element. Ergo, we should concern ourselves with emanates from our heart. At the heart of every problem is the problem of the heart. Hence, we must be mindful and guard. And it's good hygiene to wash your hands before you eat, but you're not defiling yourself spiritually, as you do not. Especially with the coronavirus is the artificial pandemic is big news at the filming of this. But get your priorities in straight, and do not obsess over the nitpicking physical minutia of physical protocols, but worry above all else about the spirit, the heart, and what you put into your heart. So what you put into your mouth is, unless it's poisonous food, it's not deadly. Any food that is given of Elohim, we Christians are commanded to enjoy with thanksgiving. Gratitude is the key, and he also breaks the bread before he multiplies it with thanksgiving. 21st verse, lesson itself. And Yahshua went out from there and withdrew to the parts of Tyre and Zidon. This is Gentile territory. These two cities would have been located in the north of Israel, the modern country of Lebanon, known as Phoenicia in the day, and the city of Tyre would have been an island city originally until the siege of Alexander the Great in 332 BM before Messiah. That's when he constructed a 6-mile inland ramp. So it was 6 mile, that distance from the sea, but it was bridged by him, and this city actually took him a year to sack, so it wasn't just easy. But it was the Phoenicians were a sea trading people. The Hebrews were a Mediterranean people, but they were not seafaring. And the Phoenicians to the north, they were famous. They colonized all across the Mediterranean. They were seafaring people. But and see, a woman of Canaan came from those borders and cried out to him, saying, have mercy on me, O master, son of David. My daughter is badly demon-possessed. This woman's identity is ethnic identity is identified in Mark's version as a Greek from Syrian Phoenicia, to be distinguished from Libyan Phoenicia. So the Phoenicians colonized all across, and they had places in Syria, which would have been to their north, and they would have colonized places in Libya to their south. They also were ethnically the Carthaginian Empire, who for a time rivaled Rome in the battle for supremacy, and the hegemony of the Mediterranean also sprang from them. But she has an accurate awareness of his messianic identity. The son of David is a messianic term. So the great question is, how could this woman from outside the borders of the Promised Land even have an intuition? And his ministry primarily consisted to the lost sheep of Israel, but occasionally we do have excursions outside of the land. And she's appealing to his mercy, and mercy and compassion is the motivating factor in several of the miracles. And she's asking for a miracle right now. An exorcism is a miracle. Demon possession is a real thing. And the thing about demon-possessed people is they are never innocent. You're not born demon-possessed, and you just don't get demon-possessed. It comes from prolonged practices and sinful things, and this invites demons who can penetrate the body and infiltrate the soul and make the demon-possessed people are robbed of their rationality, their sanity, and also their self-control. So this the severity is indicated by badly demon-possessed. So this woman is in need of a miracle, and she knows who to turn to. She knows who she's talking to. But he did not answer her a word, and his disciples came and asked him, saying, "Send her away, because she cries after us." This is seemingly uncharacteristic of the great physician to ignore the cry of mercy when it is offered, but he wasn't he was just testing her. He wanted to prove her faith. But the disciples say the same thing that they say to the children who gather around his knees: "Get them away, get them out of here. We don't want anything to do with you. We are here to escape the persecution," because the opposition and the activity would have sufficiently mounted when the Pharisees were coming all the way from Jerusalem. This was their cue to get out of there and go to the north. And he answering said, "I was not sent except to the lost sheep of the house of Israel." His ministry was exclusively comprised or nearly exclusively, we find him taking a few excursions into Samaria in John's 4th chapter, and also into Gentile territory on the border of the Sea of Galilee. And here they are closer to the Mediterranean coast than they are to the Sea of Galilee. Mediterranean coast would have been the westernmost extremity of Galilee. Sea of Galilee would have been their easternmost extremity. But he says the same thing to his disciples: "Minister not to the villages of Samaria, and concern yourselves only with the lost sheep of the house of Israel." And this was necessary because salvation comes from the Jews, but it's not their exclusive property or possession. He had to come to the house of Israel. They were charged with the evangelical mandate of witnessing to the world of Yahweh, and this they failed. So it was necessary for him. Now, the existence of prophets and being risen up in the promised land was actually a testimony of their wickedness, because they were covenant enforcers, and the nation of Israel were hard-hearted and stubborn people, so they required prophets to enforce the covenant. And finally he sent his own son, and the Israelites had abominable history of slaying the prophets and persecuting them, and they did the same thing to Yahweh's own son. But she came and was bowing to him, saying, "Master, help me." She's not giving up, and this is a testimony of her faith. She sees that she has 1 hour with him, and he's the solution to her problem, her daughter's problem. So she's not going to give up just because he's feigning actually indifference. He's just testing her faith, and the faith is there by her relentless zeal. "Help me, you are the only one who can." She references him with due deference: "Master, the son of David." And so she's asking for help, and he answering said, "It is not good to take the children's bread and throw it to the little dogs." The dogs were the nomenclature, the colloquialism of the Jews for Gentiles. They considered them unclean, much as dogs were unclean. They were not man's best friend, although there certainly were pet dogs, but they were primarily regarded as filthy. They were obsessed with hygiene, and they couldn't eat hygienic animals. But there were some pet dogs, and that's what the Greek means, the little dogs. So this is more than a completely unclean Gentile. There's still some hope to throw it to the little dogs, the dogs that would have been kept in the house. And he says that what I have to give and offer is for the Jews alone. I cannot give to you without taking for them, because I am sent to the lost sheep of Israel. And Israel was lost. They were an apostate generation. That's why the quotation we read earlier from Isaiah, the apostasy in his generation was alive and well and rampant 800 years later. But she said, "Yes, master, for even the little dogs eat the crumbs which fall from their master's table." So she knows that the blessings he has to bestow are infinite. They are not limited to her alone, but she is content to settle for the crumbs. And she has this demon-possessed daughter, and it would be as nothing to him, especially when he's in her presence and in her midst. So she's content. She does not dispute her inferior status, her her subhuman, technically, status, but she wants the crumbs which fall from the master table. She knows that he can give out of abundance, and she's just asking for a little crumb of all that he has to offer. It would be as nothing to him to just say the word, and my daughter will be healed. And Joshua answering said to him, O woman, your faith is great. Let it be to you as you desire. And her daughter was healed from that hour. So what's interesting is that throughout the Gospels, Joshua is only seemingly amazed by the faith of the Gentiles. In the 8th chapter of this book of Matthew, he marvels at the Roman centurion, the faith of whom he had not seen the likes of anywhere in Israel. And when he went to his own, there are 3 times in which he is amazed in the gospel. That story, and also Luke's version in the 7th chapter in the book which bears his name, and also in Mark 6:6 when he returns to his own denizens, his own people, his own hometown, Nazareth. He is amazed by their lack of faith. So he is always amazing, seldom amazed, but here he is amazed. This woman's faith is great. She is relentless. She will not give up. She will not accept no for an answer, and she knows that he can give it. All he has to do is say the word. So she's just asking him persistently and pestering him, but he is not bothered, and he consents to his request because he is impressed by her faith, and he knew she had the faith the whole time. He just had to test it and bring it out, and just like that, the daughter is healed. So those demons that were bothering her, that were tormenting her, that were owning her, controlling her, possessing her, enslaving her, were expelled and eliminated permanently. So when he releases people from demons, demon-possessed people are never innocent, but he sees redemptive potential in even those who had cultivated sinful practices sufficiently to invite demon possession in their life. It's not something you ask for, you can't request. It's really a prolonged practice of sins. That's when you invite demonic influences which can penetrate your soul and instill in you a loss of self-control and sanity. And moving from there, Joshua came to the Sea of Galilee, and going up on the mountain, he was sitting there. So on to new things. His excursion into Gentile territories is completed and over. We're not entirely sure what the purpose was. Perhaps he had to get away from the Pharisees, the opposition which was mounting. These men came all the way from Jerusalem to hound him and harass him. So the opposition was mounting at this time. And the fact, in the 13th chapter, he introduces the parables. This is in response to the mounting opposition, because he couldn't present his doctrines in unveiled simplicity. He had to conceal it from spiritually stubborn people. But he's back in the Sea of Galilee. This is he's in the region of Galilee. To the western extremity of the Sea of Galilee would have been the region of Galilee, which would have been to the north of Samaria, which would have been to the north of Judah. And he's in a mountain. We're not sure which one, but there are several mountains in Galilee, and he's sitting there. And large crowds came to him, having with them those who were lame, blind, dumb, crippled, and many others. And they laid them down at the feet of Joshua, and he healed them. He was the person to bring if you were blind, dumb, crippled, or anything else, lame, paralyzed, demon-possessed. He is the one whose touch and word is sufficient to reverse your ailment. So the lame can walk, the blind can see, the dumb can speak, the crippled are no longer so. They are fully functional and operational bodies, and many others. So this is just not an exhaustive list of all the ailments that he was healing. He is the great physician. He offers physical healing and spiritual healing, spiritual salvation. And he heals them all, so there is no infirmity or sickness or demon that is stronger than his healing and redemptive touch. So that the crowd marveled when they saw the dumb speaking, the crippled well, the lame walking, and the blind seeing, and they praised the Elohim of Israel. Now what's interesting here is the order in which the dumb and the crippled and lame and blind is not identical. They're lame, blind, dumb, and crippled in the 30th verse, but these are all the reversals of these curses, of these ailments, of these sicknesses. Dumb people cannot speak, suddenly they are able to. And demon-possessed, in Luke's 11th chapter, we read of a demon-possessed man, and the demon in him was mute. So that when the person is demon possessed, they take on the characteristics or the properties of the demon that is possessing them. The demon was dumb and mute, and he was making him mute. Crippled, whether paralyzed or physical handicapped in any way, their bodies are up and operational and functional and whole. Lame people are physically paralyzed from the lame down. Suddenly their strength in their legs is restored and they can see, and the blind are seeing. So imagine life without the sense of sight that we who have fully functional and operational eyes are inclined to take for granted. So, of course, the natural response is to praise the Elohim of Israel, the one through whom this had all been made possible. And whether or not they had the awareness that Yahshua was Elohim in the flesh, they were clearly aware that the power of the Father was working in him and through him. And Yahshua, having called his disciples near, said, I have compassion on the crowd, because they have now continued with me 3 days, and do not have whatever to eat, and I do not want to send them away hungry, lest they faint on the way. So this crowd, he had no ability attracting crowds, and the difficulty was the crowds just wouldn't go away. So all these people were here for these things, but if you are, when the demon-possessed man is of Mark 5 is restored to sanity, the first thing he says, he wants to be his disciple. He wants to live with him. He wants to stay with him. He wants to live with him, learn with him, grow with him, but he sends him to witness to the towns in his village and show your family the great things that God has done for you. But here, he's the master of matter and spirit, so it's not enough for him to save. He also has to heal, and he has to feed, because these men had been with him for some time. No one planned it, and it would have been inconvenient for him, but it's not inconvenient for him to multiply loaves and breads and fish, loaves of bread and fish, and he does not want to send them away hungry, because they're not going to make it back to where they have to go unless they have something to eat here and now. And the great problem is the lack of food from the foundation. And his disciples said to him, where are we to get enough bread in the desert to satisfy such a large crowd? Desert is not a good place to be when you are hungry, and there's a massive army of people who have no food. So the disciples, they want to know where. They're in the desert, so they are the desert is not a life land. You're not going to find fruit growing from the ground or anywhere. You're not going to find animals to hunt. So where can we get the bread in the desert? Bread would have been the elemental essential of dietary consumption. And they need to satisfy such a large crowd, and the exact numbers of which we read are 4,000 men in addition to women and children. This is not quite as large as the crowd in the 14th chapter, but the disciples had so recently witnessed him, and they're asking the same question. It's easy to point the finger, but we got to put ourselves in their shoes. Would we do the same thing? And the answer is probably yes. So not a whole lot of time had elapsed since they were in a similar situation, but here they are once again, seemingly none the wiser for their previous experience. And Yahshua said to them, how many loaves do you have? And they said, 7 and a few fish. I forget the exact number. I think it's 5 loaves and 2 fish, 17th verse of the 14th chapter. But here it's just a few little fish and 7 rolls. So that's slightly more. But, these fish are little, slightly more rolls of bread. But the important thing is he satisfies them fully, and they also have leftovers, same as before. And the feeding of the 5,000 is common to all Gospels, but the Mark and Matthew, they have the same sequence of events. The 15th chapter you're not going to find it anywhere else besides Matthew and Mark. Or you're going to find the parallels in the 7th and 8th chapter of Mark that we read in here. And he commanded the crowd to sit down on the ground, and taking the 7 loaves and the fish, giving thanks, he broke them and gave to his disciples, and the disciples to the crowd. So the order of the operation, the protocol is somewhat identical to the feeding of the 5,000. He starts by giving thanksgiving. He thanks him in advance before the bread even manifests. So all miracles can come from a grateful heart. And if we are grateful, he will accommodate our request and meet our provisions, and he distributes them to the disciples, who proceed to distribute them to the crowd. So from this minuscule amount, this infinitesimal amount of food, springs enough food sufficient to feed the entire crowd, the dimensions of which, the numbers of which we eventually read. It's 4,000 men, women, and children, in addition to women and children. And all ate and were satisfied, and they picked up what was left over of the broken pieces, 7 large baskets filled. I forget, I think it was 12 baskets in the feeding of the 5,000, but any attempt to ascribe numerological significance to these numbers is an exercise in idle speculation. So the number 12 and the number 7 are significant in the Hebrew numerology. 12 tribes, 7 days of creation, number of divinity, wholeness, perfection, and completeness. But it's almost incidental. So the important thing we read is that all ate and were satisfied. So not a single one was left out. They all would have had growling stomachs at this point, but their hunger is alleviated. Their hunger is satisfied sufficiently enough. So they had not only enough, but they had more than enough. And in the lesson of resourcefulness, preserve what is left over. Start with what you have, and you will have overflowing abundance, but preserve what he gives out of his abundance. And those who ate were 4,000 men, besides women and children. So we know the number of men, and perhaps they had one wife each, so around 4,000 women. Some of them might have been single of either gender, but the children would have been more numerical than the. So it's over 10,000 people at least that were filled with with 7 loaves of bread and a few little fishes. So this is truly miraculous. And dismissing the crowd, he went into the boat and came to the borders of Magdala. Magdala may be the town. It's similar, and in some manuscripts it reads as Magdala, the town from which Mary Magdalene, the most devoted and exemplary female disciple of the Master, hailed from. And she was a demon-possessed woman. She had 7 demons in her. In Luke 8:2 we read. But from the demon-possessed, the exorcism, she was transformed into an extraordinary disciple. But to return to the passage, he dismissed the crowd and he returns to the boat. He's on to the next thing. In the 16th chapter, we find him eventually in Caesarea Philippi. So he's constantly on the move because the opposition is mounting, and he has to retreat from Capernaum, which is his base of ministerial operations. He is in the desert in the final scene, and he is in Tyre in the earlier scene. But that's all the time we have for right now. Thank you so much for being here. Stay tuned until next time. I'll see you then. Take care. Bye-bye.